Picture someone in your life who hears voices, who sees things no one else can see, who becomes a different person for weeks at a time and then suddenly returns. Now ask yourself, what would happen to that person if they lived 10,000 years ago? The answer is not what you think. For most of recorded history, we have been taught a single story about mental illness and ancient societies. The story goes like this. They did not understand it. They feared it. They burned the afflicted, cast them out, trepanned their skulls to let the demons escape. And some of that is true, but it is only a fragment of the picture. The full picture is stranger, more complicated, and in some ways more humane than anything you would expect. Your brain is around 300,000 years old in its current form. The circuits that misfire in schizophrenia, in bipolar disorder, in severe depression, those circuits were running long before writing existed, long before cities, long before the concept of medicine, which means ancient humans were living alongside these conditions for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word about them. So, what did they actually do? Archaeologist David Lewis Williams spent decades studying the rock art of the Sand People of southern Africa and the painted caves of Europe. What he found changed how researchers think about altered mental states in ancient cultures. The images, the geometric spirals, the half-human, half-animal figures, the beings that seem to pass through walls, are not random. They match, with stunning precision, the visual hallucinations produced by certain mental states, trance, fever, psychosis. What Lewis Williams argues is that these altered states were not feared. They were sought. They were sacred. Think about what that means for a moment. If your neighbor's mind produced visions that no one else could access, your first instinct today might be to call for help, to get them medicated, to manage the condition so they could function in a world built for neurotypical brains. But in a world without that framework, without the diagnosis, without the pharmaceutical option, the same experience would have no clinical name. It would have only the name the community gave it. And across dozens of ancient cultures, that name was something close to chosen. The anthropologist Mircea Eliade documented shamanic traditions across Siberia, Central Asia, the Americas, and sub-Saharan Africa. In nearly every culture he studied, the shaman, the healer, the spiritual intermediary, the keeper of invisible knowledge, was not someone who had always been calm and stable. They were someone who had passed through a crisis, a breakdown, a period of wild visions and voices and confusion so profound that their community believed they had died and been reborn. The illness, in other words, was not the disqualification. It was the initiation. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern repeated across so many separate cultures and time periods that researchers have given it a name, the wounded healer archetype. The idea that the person most qualified to navigate suffering is the one who has already survived it from the inside. Now, does this mean ancient life was better for people with what we now call mental illness? Absolutely not. The evidence is far more complicated than a simple yes or no, consider trepanation. You may have seen the skulls. Stone Age skulls, some dating back 9,000 years, with round holes carefully cut into the bone. For a long time, this was interpreted as crude surgery meant to release evil spirits. But bioarchaeologist Maria Mednikova examined hundreds of these skulls and found something that disrupted that interpretation entirely. Many of the skulls showed bone regrowth around the edges of the holes. That means the patient survived the procedure, not for a day, for years, some for decades. Whatever trepanation was, it was not simply execution by another name. It was a procedure that the community invested significant effort in performing and that patients were expected to recover from. Whether it was used for mental illness specifically is debated. Some researchers believe it targeted seizures, persistent headaches, or behavioral changes that followed head injuries. Others believe it addressed what we would now recognize as psychotic episodes. The truth is probably all of the above, Because the ancient mind did not draw the clean line between brain, spirit, behavior, and health that modern medicine draws. What we do know is this. The ancient world had no unified theory of mental illness as a medical category, but it was not without understanding. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, early written records show elaborate systems for interpreting and treating what we would now recognize as psychiatric symptoms. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dating to ancient Egypt, around 1600 BCE, but likely copied from texts far older, describes behavioral and psychological changes following head trauma, with a clinical precision that surprised modern neurologists when it was first translated. The ancient Egyptians were watching. They were recording. They were trying to understand cause and effect. In ancient Mesopotamia, the symptoms of what we might now call severe depression were documented in cuneiform tablets alongside treatments. Some treatments were ritual, some were herbal, some involved social support structures that look, from a distance, remarkably like what modern psychiatry calls a therapeutic community. The sick person was not always expelled. They were sometimes surrounded. Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived around 460 BCE, broke from the dominant tradition of his time by insisting that mental disturbances were not sent by the gods. They arose from the brain, from imbalances in what he called humors, fluids in the body that, when thrown out of balance, produced mania, melancholy, or paranoia. His theory was wrong in its specifics, but the direction of the argument was revolutionary. He was pointing at the organ. He was saying, this is a body problem, not a punishment. His student tradition produced Galen, whose influence on Western medicine lasted over 1,000 years. And Galen agreed, the mind was produced by the body. Treat the body, and you treat the mind. But here is the twist that changes everything. None of this was the dominant experience for most ancient humans. Hippocrates and Galen were elite physicians writing for literate urban populations. The vast majority of human beings across most of human history did not live in cities. They lived in small bands, groups of 20 to 50 people moving across landscapes dependent on each member to survive. In that world, mental illness created a specific kind of problem, not a moral problem, a practical one. Psychiatrist and evolutionary biologist Randolph Nessa has written extensively about what he calls the evolutionary mismatch, the idea that many mental health conditions were not always purely disadvantageous. Some of the traits that cluster around conditions like bipolar disorder, the heightened creativity, the reduced need for sleep during manic phases, the intense pattern recognition, the fearlessness, may have provided genuine advantages in certain contexts. The person who never slept, who saw connections others missed, who felt no fear before a hunt, that person was difficult to live with, and also, sometimes, essential. What this suggests is not that ancient humans had the right answer. It suggests that ancient humans had a different problem. They were not asking, how do we cure this person? They were asking, how do we keep this person in the group? How do we make this person useful? How do we make their difference survivable for everyone? And the answers they arrived at, the healer role, the ritual role, the spiritual interpreter role, were not medical solutions. They were social ones. The community absorbed the difference by giving it a function. Today, that function is largely gone. Modern society is not built around 20-person survival bands where every member's unique contribution is essential to the group's survival. It is built around institutions, productivity metrics, and the ability to function independently. The person who hears voices does not have a shaman's hut to walk into. They have a waiting list. There is no romantic conclusion here. Ancient life for someone in the grip of severe mental illness was often brutal. Starvation, cold, infection, and violence did not pause for psychiatric crises. Many people died. Many were abandoned. The historical record is not a utopia. But what the record does show, in the shamanic traditions, in the trepan skulls, in the medical papyri, in the cuneiform tablets, in the cave paintings that map the geometry of altered states, is that the human response to mental difference has always been more varied, more creative, and more socially complex than a single story can hold. Your brain right now is the same brain those ancient people carried, the same circuits, the same fault lines, the same capacity for breakdown and for transcendence. The next time you see someone whose mind works in ways the world was not built for, you are seeing something your ancestors saw 10,000 years ago. And the question they asked then is the same question you are asked now. Not, what is wrong with them? But, what do we do with them? How do we keep them in the group? Ancient humans did not always get that answer right. But the fact that they kept asking it, that is the part that stayed.